Ethan Caldwell leaned against the cool glass of his penthouse window, staring down at the glittering New York skyline. The city stretched beneath him, pulsing with movement, its lights flickering like 1,000 invitations to lives he no longer touched. From this height, 50 stories above the streets, everything looked small, manageable, under control. He lifted the tumbler in his hand, the amber liquid swirling before he took a slow sip. Aged whiskey, imported from Scotland, worth more than most people's rent. It tasted like nothing. Behind him, the after-party continued in full force. The penthouse buzzed with elegant laughter, the clinking of crystal glasses, the hushed exchanges of deals disguised as flirtations. A crowd of the city's elite, investors, CEOs, socialites, filled his home, each vying for a moment of his attention. To them, he was Ethan Caldwell, billionaire real estate mogul, a man who had it all. And yet there wasn't a single person in that room he truly wanted to talk to. Mr. Caldwell Ethan didn't turn. He recognized the voice. Nathan Pierce, his oldest friend, the only one who spoke to him like a person rather than a financial empire. Nathan stepped beside him, following his gaze over the city. "You look like a man trying to drink his way through a revelation." Ethan exhaled sharply. "That obvious?" Painfully. Nathan took a sip of his own drink, waiting a beat before adding, "Is this about the board meeting today? Or something else?" Ethan dragged a hand over his jaw. "It's nothing." Nathan snorted. "Right. Because brooding at a window alone during your own party is the universal sign of happiness." Ethan didn't respond. He wasn't in the mood for self-reflection, but he also knew Nathan well enough to realize he wouldn't let it go. Nathan leaned against the window, assessing him with quiet scrutiny. "You ever wonder if any of this is enough?" Ethan stiffened. "What?" "This." Nathan gestured around the penthouse to the marble floors, the designer furniture, the curated perfection of wealth. The empire, the success. Does it ever feel like it's missing something? Ethan set his glass down a little too forcefully. "We built this, Nathan. You think I regret that?" "I didn't say regret." Nathan's voice was even. "I said missing something." Ethan turned away, brushing past a group of well-dressed women who threw flirtatious glances his way. He barely noticed them. There was a time when he might have. A time when power and success had been his singular focus, when he thought building an empire would fill the void inside him. But lately, the silence at the end of the night had grown deafening. Nathan caught up with him near the bar. "Look, I get it. You wanted to build something untouchable, and you did." He hesitated, then added, "But 6 years is a long time, Ethan. You ever think about—" "No." Ethan cut him off. He didn't need to hear it, didn't need to revisit that part of his past. Nathan sighed but didn't push further. "All right, fine. But if you ever do—" "I won't." Ethan turned away, signaling to his driver. He needed air. The streets were alive with a late-night hum, a chaotic contrast to the cold, calculated world he lived in. Ethan walked with no destination in mind. He rarely did this, allowed himself to exist outside of control. But something about tonight, about Nathan's words, had unsettled him, missing something. It wasn't about money. He had more than he could ever spend. It wasn't about power. He had that too. So why did the thought linger? His steps slowed as he reached Central Park, the quiet rustling of trees breaking through the city's relentless energy. He remembered this place. A lifetime ago, it felt like. A sharp laugh caught his attention. Children's laughter. Ethan turned, his gaze landing on a pair of blonde-haired little girls, twirling near the fountain. Their matching dresses swayed as they spun, their giggles echoing into the night. He wasn't sure why he noticed them. He never noticed kids. But something about them made him pause. Something familiar. Then one of them turned, and his world tilted. Hanging around her small neck, glinting under the park lights, was a silver, heart-shaped locket. A locket he knew. His chest constricted. Number it couldn't be. For the first time in 6 years, Ethan felt something crack inside him. And then, from a nearby bench, he heard a voice that nearly brought him to his knees. "Lily, Sophie, it's time to go." Ethan's breath left him. Selena. She was here, and with her, 2 little girls who had his eyes. Ethan's world tilted as he stood frozen in the middle of Central Park, his heart pounding in his chest. It was impossible. And yet, there she was. Selena. The woman who had vanished from his life 6 years ago without a trace. She sat on a nearby bench, unaware of him yet, her posture relaxed but her gaze watchful as she observed the 2 little girls playing near the fountain. His daughters. Ethan's mind reeled. His pulse hammered. 2 girls, twin girls. Their golden hair caught the glow of the street lamps, their bright blue eyes, his eyes, sparkling as they laughed. And that locket, the same silver heart-shaped locket he had given Selena so many years ago. A slow, suffocating weight pressed against his chest. She had kept it. After all these years. But she hadn't just kept the locket, she had kept this secret. A secret that had his eyes, his blood, his name, his daughters. His feet moved before he could think. One step, then another. The girls were still caught up in their game, completely unaware. But as if sensing something, Selena looked up, and everything else ceased to exist. Her lips parted slightly, her breath catching as their gazes collided. Shock. Then something else. Fear. Selena went pale, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench. Ethan saw it, the briefest flicker of panic in her expression, the slight shake of her hands as she stared at him. She knew. She knew he knew. Ethan clenched his fists, his jaw tightening as he stepped forward. "Selena," he said, his voice low but sharp, barely contained. She flinched. For a moment, she looked like she might run, like she was about to grab the girls and disappear, just like she had 6 years ago. But she didn't move. Instead, she exhaled shakily, glancing toward the girls as if deciding whether to shield them. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Ethan." His name on her lips, after all these years, sent a surge of emotions through him. Pain, anger, longing. The girls turned toward her, sensing the sudden change in atmosphere. Lily, the one wearing the locket, tilted her head, looking between them with quiet curiosity. "Mom?" Ethan's chest tightened at the word. Mom, his daughter's mother. His gaze dropped to them again, to the way they looked so much like him. How had he not known? How had she kept them from him? Selena's fingers twitched, as if she wanted to reach for them, to pull them away. But she stayed still, like a deer caught in headlights. And then she did something that nearly shattered him. She swallowed hard and forced a smile. For them, not for him. "Girls, why don't you go back and play for a little longer?" Her voice was gentle but firm. "I'll be right here." Lily and Sophie hesitated, but then, without question, they obeyed, as if they were used to listening to her, as if they had never known another voice to trust. Ethan barely waited for them to be out of earshot before he spoke, his voice hard with betrayal. "Are they mine?" Selena's breath hitched, her lips parted as if she wanted to lie. But when she exhaled again, her eyes closed briefly, her shoulders falling. "Yes." The single word was like a gunshot to his chest. A confession. A confirmation of everything he already knew but couldn't bring himself to believe. His fingers curled into fists. "How long have you known?" Selina opened her eyes again, regret flickering across her face. Since the moment I found out I was pregnant. Ethan let out a sharp laugh, cold, humorless, filled with disbelief. Since the moment you found out. His voice was dangerously quiet. And you never thought to tell me? She looked away, her fingers twisting together in her lap. Ethan, not here, please. He followed her gaze to the twins, to the two little girls who had no idea their entire world was about to change. Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing himself to rein in his emotions. Fine, not here. But this wasn't over. Selina reached into her bag and pulled out a small slip of paper, scribbling something onto it before handing it to him. Meet me here in an hour. Ethan took it, his eyes never leaving hers. You don't get to walk away from this, Selina. Her lips trembled slightly, and for the first time since he had seen her, she looked as broken as he felt. I know. Without another word, she turned back to the girls, taking each of their tiny hands in hers, leading them away. Ethan watched them go, his fingers clenching around the paper so tightly it crumpled in his palm. 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years of believing she was gone. 6 years of missing out on their lives. And now, he was going to find out why. Ethan arrived at the address exactly 1 hour later. It was a small cafe tucked away on a quiet street, far from the towering skyscrapers and sleek high-end restaurants that had become his world. The kind of place that felt warm, familiar, like home, like something he hadn't known in years. Selina was already there. She sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, her gaze fixed on the window as if she were lost in thought, or gathering courage. Ethan took a breath, forcing himself to keep his emotions in check. But every step closer made that harder. 6 years. 6 years of silence. 6 years of believing she was gone. And the entire time, she had been raising his daughters. Selina looked up just as he reached the table, her fingers tightening around the ceramic mug. You came, she said softly. Ethan let out a dry, humorless chuckle as he slid into the seat across from her. Did you think I wouldn't? Selina exhaled, looking down. I don't know what I expected. Ethan leaned forward, planting his elbows on the table, his voice low and controlled, but barely. Then let me make something clear, Selina. You don't get to disappear for 6 years, have my children, and then act surprised when I demand answers. She flinched, guilt flickering across her face. Ethan didn't care. He deserved the truth. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then she took a deep breath and met his gaze. I was scared. Ethan's jaw clenched. Not enough. Of what? Selina hesitated. Then, almost too quietly, she said, of what telling you would mean. Ethan sat back, shaking his head. Of what it would mean. A sharp, bitter laugh escaped him. Unbelievable. You think I wouldn't have wanted them? She flinched again, but this time she didn't look away. Would you? She asked softly. Ethan's chest tightened. You were ruthless back then, Ethan. Her voice was steady, but there was something fragile beneath it. You were obsessed with your career, with growing your empire. You barely made time for me, let alone anything else. She let out a slow breath. So no. I wasn't sure you would have wanted them. Not really. Ethan felt the words like a punch to the gut. She wasn't wrong. Back then, he had been a different man. Work had come first, always, and it had cost him everything. He ran a hand over his jaw, a storm brewing in his chest. So, instead of giving me a choice, you made the decision for me? Selina swallowed hard. I didn't want them to feel like a burden, Ethan. I didn't want them to grow up wondering if their father saw them as an obligation. Ethan's fingers curled into fists. You didn't even give me the chance to prove I wouldn't. I know. The regret in her voice was real, and I can't take that back. Silence stretched between them, heavy, unforgiving. Ethan clenched his jaw, his emotions warring inside him. He wanted to be furious, but beneath the anger, beneath the betrayal, there was something deeper, something more painful. Loss. Loss for the years he would never get back. Loss for the first steps, the first words, the bedtime stories he had missed. Loss for the family he never knew he had. Selina exhaled slowly, watching him. I don't expect you to forgive me, Ethan. Ethan met her gaze, his voice cold and even. Good, because I don't. She blinked, and for a second, something flashed in her eyes. Pain. Ethan should have felt satisfaction. He didn't. Instead, he pressed his palms against the table and leaned in. What now, Selina? Her breath caught, because she knew what he meant. The past couldn't be undone. But the future? That was a different battle. Selina hesitated, then looked away. I don't know. Wrong answer. Then figure it out. Ethan's voice was sharp, final. Because I'm not walking away from this. From them. Selina lifted her gaze, searching his face. Looking for what, he wasn't sure. And then something changed in her expression. She nodded. It wasn't much. It wasn't a declaration or an apology or an invitation, but it was a start. Ethan had spent his entire life negotiating deals, closing contracts, and controlling every outcome. But this was the first battle he couldn't strategize his way through. He sat behind the wheel of his black Aston Martin, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The conversation with Selina still echoed in his mind. You didn't even give me the chance. I was scared. Then figure it out. He should have been furious, and he was. But underneath the anger was something far worse. A hollow ache that nothing could fix. He had daughters. 2 little girls who had gone to bed tonight without even knowing who he was. The thought made his chest tighten, his stomach twist with something he didn't recognize. Regret. Loss. A grief for the time stolen from him. With a sharp exhale, he started the engine and pulled out into the empty street, his mind already set. This wasn't over. The next morning, Ethan walked through the sleek marble lobby of Caldwell Industries, his headlines already dominating the business world. His assistant, Monica, hurried to keep pace beside him, her heels clicking against the floor. You have a 9 a.m. investor briefing, then lunch with a... Cancel my morning. She blinked. Excuse me? I said cancel it. His voice left no room for argument. Monica adjusted her glasses. Sir, this deal is not more important than this. He kept walking. For the first time in years, his business wasn't his priority. His personal life, the one thing he had always refused to acknowledge as something that mattered, now demanded his full attention. By noon, he was outside Selina's house. It was a modest 2-story home in a quiet Brooklyn neighborhood, the kind of place where families grew roots, where people built lives instead of empires. Ethan couldn't remember the last time he had stepped into a house like this. He wasn't sure if he ever had. Taking a steadying breath, he walked to the front door and knocked. A moment later, the door swung open, and there she was. Selina stood in the doorway, her hair pulled into a loose bun, wearing faded jeans and a soft sweater, a far cry from the woman he used to know in designer dresses and sharp heels. But she was still breathtakingly familiar. For a moment, she just stared at him. Then, with a quiet sigh, she stepped back, leaving the door open. An invitation. Ethan didn't hesitate. The inside of her home was nothing like his penthouse. It was warm, lived in, cluttered in a way that spoke of love rather than neglect. There were tiny shoes by the door, a colorful backpack tossed on the couch, a few crayon drawings pinned to the fridge, all proof of the years he had missed. Ethan forced himself to breathe through it. Selena led him into the living room, gesturing for him to sit. He did. She settled into a chair across from him, pulling her legs up slightly, as if trying to make herself smaller. It struck him how different she seemed from the woman he had once known. That Selena had been fearless, fiery. She had fought him on everything. This Selena looked worn down, tired. He hated it. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Ethan broke the silence. "Where are they?" Selena hesitated before answering. "At school." Something inside him twisted. School, another piece of their lives he knew nothing about. He exhaled slowly, leaning forward. "I want to meet them, Selena." Her fingers tightened around the fabric of her sweater. "I know." "But?" His voice was sharp. She looked away. I don't know how to do this, Ethan." He swallowed hard. "You had 6 years to figure it out." Her eyes snapped back to his, a flash of pain and guilt in them. "And do you think it was easy? Raising them alone?" Ethan clenched his jaw. "You didn't have to." Selena let out a breath. "Maybe not, but I did." Silence settled between them again. Ethan forced himself to look at her, really look at her. She wasn't the woman he had lost. She was the mother of his children, and he needed to start understanding her choices, even if he hated them. He softened his voice. "I just want a chance, Selena." She swallowed, something shifting in her expression. Finally, she nodded. "They come home at 3. Ethan felt the breath rush out of him. A door, slightly open, a chance. It wasn't much, but for the first time since seeing that locket in Central Park, he felt like he could finally breathe, and he wasn't going to waste it. Ethan sat on Selena's couch, his pulse drumming a steady, insistent beat in his ears. 3 o'clock was approaching fast. Outside, the occasional hum of passing cars broke the silence, but inside the air felt too still, thick with tension, heavy with things neither he nor Selena knew how to say. She sat across from him, arms folded, legs tucked beneath her, the careful distance between them deliberate. If he didn't know better, he'd say she was bracing for impact. Or maybe she was bracing for him. He exhaled, pressing his palms against his knees. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted. Selena's lips parted slightly, as if surprised by the honesty. Then something in her gaze softened. "Neither do I," she murmured. The moment stretched between them. A rare, fragile truce. Then came the sound that changed everything. The front door swung open, and 2 high-pitched voices tumbled into the house. Excited, carefree, unaware of the storm waiting inside. "Mom, you won't believe what happened at school today." Ethan's heart stopped. Footsteps thundered across the floor, growing louder, closer, until suddenly 2 little girls burst into the room. They froze. He did too, face to face. For the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell looked into the eyes of his daughters. Lily, Sophie. His mind whirled, cataloging everything. The way Sophie's golden curls bounced as she shifted on her feet, eyes darting curiously between her mother and him. The way Lily's blue gaze sharpened, her small arms crossing defensively. She was the cautious one. She was his. He swallowed, his throat suddenly dry. Selena cleared her throat. "Girls, I want you to meet someone." Silence. A slow, heavy silence that pressed against his ribs, suffocating. Then Lily spoke, her voice small but firm. "Who is he?" Ethan had expected it, but the question still hit like a wrecking ball. Selena hesitated. Too long. So he answered, "My name is Ethan." He leaned forward slightly, keeping his voice steady even. "And I'm your father." Lily's lips parted slightly, then pressed together again. Sophie blinked. "Our... what?" Selina swallowed. "You're dead, sweetheart." The words landed in the room like a fragile thing, something neither of them knew how to hold. For a moment the girls didn't move. Then Sophie tilted her head. "So, you're rich?" Ethan blinked. Of all the things they could have asked, Selina sighed. "Sophie." "What? He looks like one of those fancy men on TV," she whispered, not subtly, to her sister. Lily didn't react. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Ethan forced a smile. "Yes, I suppose I am." Sophie narrowed her eyes, examining him. "Do you have a butler?" Ethan almost laughed. Almost. No butler. Her lips pursed in disappointment. Lily, however, wasn't amused. She took a step closer, brows furrowed. "Where have you been?" Ethan's chest tightened. Sophie nudged her sister. "Lily, no." Lily's voice was sharp. "Where was he?" "All this time?" Ethan looked at Selina. She looked away. Fair enough. This was his to answer. "I didn't know about you," he said, his voice quieter than before. "Not until yesterday." Lily's gaze narrowed. Mom knew. It wasn't a question. It was accusation. Selina stiffened. "Lily, Lily turned back to Ethan. "So now you just show up?" The hurt in her voice was sharp, cutting right through him. Ethan leaned forward, not to intimidate, but to show her he was listening. "I know this isn't fair," he said carefully. "I know you have every reason to be mad at me. I would be too." She stared at him, unmoving. "But I don't want to be a stranger to you." His voice was calm, steady, real. "I just want the chance to know you, and for you to know me." Lily's little hands fisted at her sides. Then, to his absolute devastation, she whispered, "I don't know if I want that." The words knocked the wind out of him. Sophie glanced between them, nervous. "I mean, we could try?" Lily's expression darkened. Sophie hesitated, then turned back to Ethan. "What do you even do?" Ethan exhaled. "I build things." "What kind of things?" "Buildings, hotels, skyscrapers." Sophie's eyes widened. "Like huge ones?" He nodded. Lily, however, looked unimpressed. "Anyone can build a building. Can you build something important?" Ethan paused. She didn't mean hotels, she didn't mean skyscrapers. She meant this, the ruins of what they could have been. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell realized he was facing the most important deal of his career. Not a contract, not a business merger, but the chance to build a relationship with the daughters he never knew existed. And it was a deal he couldn't afford to lose. Ethan had walked into hundreds of boardrooms, faced down some of the most ruthless businessmen in the world, negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals that had reshaped cities. But sitting in Selina's living room, staring at his daughters, he felt utterly out of his depth. Lily had already pulled away, folding her arms as if she could physically block him out. Her expression was unreadable, but her body language spoke volumes. Sophie, on the other hand, was still watching him, curious but cautious. Like she hadn't decided yet whether he was worth the trouble. And Selina sat quietly on the edge of the couch, hands resting in her lap, watching but not interfering. Ethan exhaled, shifting forward. He had to tread carefully here. "Lily," he started, "I know this isn't easy." "I don't know you," she cut in sharply. "So why should I care?" Her words were blunt, cold. But beneath them, Ethan heard the unspoken question. "Why should I trust you?" The words hit harder than they should have. He had expected hesitation, maybe even anger. But this? This was rejection, and he had no idea what to do with it. Sophie nudged her sister. "Lily." But Lily shook her head, staring at Ethan with a look he had seen in boardroom negotiations. Calculating. Guarded. God. She was so much like him. Ethan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees, matching her gaze with quiet determination. You're right, he admitted. You don't know me, and I don't know you. Lily blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. But that doesn't mean I don't want to, he continued, his voice steady. And it doesn't mean I don't care. Silence. A long, heavy silence. Then Lily's lips pressed together. I think you're just saying that. Ethan exhaled through his nose. This was a battle, and for the first time in his life, he was willing to fight for something that had nothing to do with money or power. Selina cleared her throat softly. Lily, sweetheart. Lily stood up suddenly, her little chin lifting defiantly. I have homework, she muttered before walking toward the stairs. She didn't look back. Ethan watched her go, feeling an ache he didn't know how to name. When she was gone, Sophie sighed dramatically and turned to him. She's like that with new people. New people. The word settled in Ethan's chest like a stone. That's all he was to them. A stranger. His throat tightened, but he forced a small smile. And you? Sophie tapped her chin in exaggerated thought, then shrugged. I don't know yet. Ethan huffed out a quiet laugh. At least she was honest. Sophie studied him for a long moment, then pointed at his wrist. You still have that shiny watch. Ethan glanced at his Rolex, the one he had barely noticed before. You like watches? He asked, trying to keep the conversation alive. Sophie grinned. No, but it's fun to guess how much things cost. Mom says I shouldn't, though. Ethan smirked, then glanced at Selina, who gave Sophie a warning look. You don't need to guess, sweetheart, Selina said gently. It's not polite. Sophie pouted. But I'm really good at it. Ethan leaned in, lowering his voice like he was sharing a secret. How much do you think it is? Sophie narrowed her eyes at the watch, then at him, then at the watch again. 5,000. Ethan raised a brow. Higher. Sophie's jaw dropped. 10,000? Higher. Her eyes widened. 20? Ethan smirked. 35. Sophie gasped like she had just won the lottery. That's crazy. Selina sighed, shaking her head. And this is exactly why I tell you not to ask. Sophie grinned unapologetically. But it's fun. Ethan laughed, genuinely, for the first time in what felt like years. Selina exhaled, hiding a small smile as she turned to Sophie. All right, why don't you go upstairs and check on your sister? Sophie groaned but slid off the couch. Fine. As she reached the stairs, she turned back to Ethan. Are you going to come back? Ethan's chest tightened. He met her gaze, steady. Do you want me to? Sophie tilted her head, thinking. Then, after a long pause, she shrugged. Maybe. Ethan smiled. I'll take that. And then, just like that, she disappeared up the stairs, leaving him alone with Selina. The real battle. Selina sighed, rubbing her temples. I should have warned you about Lily. Ethan shook his head. No, you shouldn't have. She's right to be cautious. Selina studied him, as if trying to read his intentions. She's slow to trust people, even with me sometimes. Ethan exhaled, his jaw tightening. Because she's used to people leaving? Selina flinched. It was a low blow, and he knew it. She sighed, folding her arms. I didn't want to make her promises I wasn't sure you'd keep. Ethan's gaze hardened. I keep my promises, Selina. She arched a brow. Do you? Something in her voice stung. Because 6 years ago, he hadn't. Ethan clenched his fists. I made mistakes, I know that. But this? He gestured toward the stairs. This isn't something I'm walking away from. Selina searched his face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. You really mean that? She whispered. Ethan's throat tightened, more than anything. Selina exhaled, looking down at her hands. All right. Ethan froze. All right, he repeated. Selina lifted her gaze, meeting his with something unreadable. "I'll let you be in their lives," she said softly, "but on my terms." Ethan let out a slow breath. It wasn't a victory, but it was a start. And right now, that was enough. Ethan stood outside Selena's house, the cool autumn air biting at the edges of his suit jacket. He wasn't used to waiting, not in business, not in life. But right now, standing here, waiting for Selena to let him in, waiting for his daughters to accept him, it felt like the only thing he could do. Selena had agreed to let him in, on her terms, and that meant starting slow. Today was the first step, spending time with them, but in their space, on their terms. The front door opened. Selena stood there, her expression unreadable. "You're early." Ethan smirked, but it was tight. "I didn't want to be late." She exhaled, stepping aside. "Come in, then." Ethan walked in, the house still unfamiliar but already significant. Selena led him to the living room, where Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, surrounded by an explosion of colored pencils and papers. Lily, however, was perched on the couch, a book in her lap, her small fingers drumming against the pages. The sight of them, just existing, just being, hit Ethan harder than he expected. "Hey," he said, his voice softer than usual. Sophie looked up first. "Hi." Lily barely glanced at him. Selena gestured toward the couch. "Make yourself comfortable." He sat, but not too close to Lily. He wasn't going to push. Sophie picked up a drawing, waving it toward him. "Look, I made a picture of a castle." Ethan took the paper, studying the crayon masterpiece. The castle had tall, pointed towers, a winding bridge, and tiny stick-figure people standing in front of it. "Impressive," he said. "Do you like castles?" Sophie nodded eagerly. "They're fancy." Ethan smirked. "You like fancy things, huh?" Sophie shrugged. "Maybe." Lily let out a small sigh, still focused on her book. Ethan's gaze flickered to her. "What are you reading?" Lily hesitated before finally looking at him. She studied him for a long second, then held up the book's cover. Ethan's brows lifted. An adventure novel. He knew it well. "I used to love that book," he said. Lily's eyes narrowed slightly, like she didn't quite believe him. "You've read it?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "More than once." Lily tilted her head, intrigued but not convinced. "What happens in the end?" Ethan leaned forward slightly. "Would you rather I tell you, or would you rather be surprised?" Lily's lips pressed together. Then, to his surprise, she let out a small, grudging nod of approval. It wasn't much, but it was something. An hour passed. Selena had drifted into the kitchen, leaving him alone with the girls. Sophie was chatting nonstop, telling him about her ballet class, her favorite ice cream flavors, and her very serious belief that mermaids might be real. Lily, on the other hand, was quieter, but she wasn't ignoring him anymore. Every so often she would glance at him, as if studying him, testing him. Ethan let her. He knew this was a process, a slow, deliberate process. Sophie stretched her legs out, tilting her head. "Hey, do you have a big house?" Ethan smirked. "I do." Sophie's eyes widened. "With a pool?" "Yes." "A really big pool?" "Yes." Lily rolled her eyes. "That doesn't make him special." Sophie turned to her. "I didn't say it did." Lily arched a brow. "You kind of did." Sophie huffed. "Well, maybe he could show us one day." Ethan stilled. Lily's gaze snapped to him, and she looked almost annoyed at her sister's suggestion. Selena, who had just walked in from the kitchen, stiffened slightly. Ethan didn't miss the warning in her eyes. Don't push too fast. So he didn't. Instead, he looked at Sophie and said, "Maybe, someday." And then he looked at Lily and let her see that he wasn't expecting anything. She relaxed, just a little. Selena exhaled quietly, shifting her weight. "All right, girls, time to clean up." Sophie groaned dramatically, but didn't argue. Lily, however, looked at Ethan one last time. Not as cold as before. Not warm either, but somewhere in between. And that was progress. Later at the door, Ethan stood in the entryway, facing Selena. "That went better than expected," she murmured. Ethan nodded. "I think so." Selena studied him for a moment. "You didn't push." He exhaled. "I'm not trying to win them over in a day, Selena." Her lips pressed together. "I know, I don't want them to get hurt." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Neither do I." For a second, something passed between them. A memory, a past that had once held so much love and possibility, before it all fell apart. Selena cleared her throat, breaking the moment. "Same time next week?" she asked. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, same time." He turned to leave, but paused, glancing back. "Selena?" She looked at him. "I meant what I said." His voice was quiet but firm. "I'm not going anywhere." Selena didn't speak, but she nodded. And for now, that was enough. Ethan had spent the past week replaying every moment of his visit with Lily and Sophie. Every look, every word, every carefully measured silence. Lily didn't trust him. Sophie was open, but Lily was diffy. She was guarded, skeptical, and he understood why. He had spent 6 years unknowingly absent. But now he had to prove that he was here to stay. That meant playing by Selena's rules. And right now, that meant standing outside a small family-owned diner, waiting for their second visit. It wasn't his usual kind of meeting spot, but it was Selena's choice, and he was willing to follow her lead, until she gave him a reason not to. The bell above the door jingled as he stepped inside. Selena was already there, sitting at a booth near the back. She had Lily on one side and Sophie on the other, both girls focused on the menus in front of them. Ethan hesitated for only a second before walking over. Sophie spotted him first. "Hi," she greeted, her grin wide. Ethan smiled, relieved by at least one warm reception. "Hey, kid." Lily glanced up but didn't say anything, still watching, still waiting. Selena gestured to the seat across from her. "We already ordered drinks." Ethan slid in. "That's fine." A server approached, placing a chocolate milkshake in front of Sophie and a plain lemonade in front of Lily. Sophie beamed. "Mom says I can have 1 milkshake a week. I picked today." Ethan chuckled. "Good choice." Lily remained quiet, stirring her lemonade with a straw, testing him. Ethan turned to her. "You don't like milkshakes?" Lily barely looked up. "I like lemonade." Her voice was measured, neutral. Sophie giggled, leaning toward Ethan as if to share a secret. "She doesn't like things that are too sweet." Lily shot her a mild glare. Ethan smirked. "Lemonade's a solid choice." Lily shrugged. "I know." Selena cleared her throat. "So, I thought we'd do something casual today, just lunch, no pressure." Ethan nodded. "Sounds good to me." Lily studied him like she was trying to poke holes in his patience. Sophie, on the other hand, seemed determined to fill the silence. "Did you know I'm going to be a ballerina?" she announced between sips of her milkshake. Ethan grinned. "Oh, yeah?" Sophie nodded, her curls bouncing. "I already take classes. Mom takes me every Saturday." Ethan looked at Selena. "Ballet, huh?" Selena tilted her head slightly, a trace of a smile on her lips. "She's been obsessed since she was 3. Ethan turned back to Sophie. "Do you have a favorite performance?" Sophie lit up. "The Nutcracker. We're going to see it next month, right, Mom?" Selena nodded. "That's the plan." Sophie suddenly gasped dramatically. "You should come." Selena froze. Lily looked up sharply. Ethan didn't react immediately. He felt the shift in the air. Selena was waiting for him to say something. Lily was watching to see how he handled it. He chose his words carefully. "If your mom's okay with it," he said, "I'd love to." Selena exhaled slowly, clearly thrown off. Lily set her lemonade down with a pointed finality. "You don't have to come just because she asked." Sophie frowned. "Lily—" "I'm serious," Lily interrupted, her gaze locked on Ethan. "You don't have to pretend." Ethan met her stare, unwavering. She was testing him again. He could see Selena tense beside her, waiting for him to react. And maybe the Ethan Caldwell of 6 years ago would have snapped, would have shut it down, controlled the conversation, made sure he walked away on top. But this wasn't a business deal. This was his daughter. "I'm not pretending," he said, his voice even. "If you don't want me there, I won't come." Lily's brows furrowed slightly, not the answer she was expecting. Sophie nudged her. "You don't have to be mean." Lily sighed, sitting back in the booth. "I'm not. I'm just saying he doesn't have to act like he wants to be here." Selena finally spoke, her voice firm but calm. "Lily." Lily dropped her gaze to the table. "Whatever." Ethan exhaled slowly. Selena shook her head. "I'm sorry." Ethan shook his head. "She doesn't need to apologize for how she feels." Lily's gaze flicked up at that. Briefly, curiously. Sophie pouted at her sister. "You could try being nice." Lily didn't respond, but her shoulders softened just slightly. Selena sighed and looked at Ethan. "This is going to take time." He nodded. "I'm not in a hurry." Selena studied him, her expression unreadable. "We'll see." And just like that, the tension eased, but only slightly. One step forward, one step back. But Ethan would take it. Ethan sat in the back seat of his car, his hands steepled beneath his chin, staring out at the darkened city skyline. The low hum of New York traffic filled the space, but his thoughts were elsewhere. Back at that diner, back at the sharp way Lily had looked at him. "You don't have to act like you want to be here." She was testing him, pushing to see if he would break, if he would give up. But he wouldn't. Because this wasn't just a challenge. It wasn't a business deal. It was his family. "Sir?" His driver's voice pulled him from his thoughts. "Back to the office?" Ethan hesitated. Normally, the answer would be an automatic yes. But tonight? "No," he said. "Take me home." For the first time in years, he wasn't burying himself in work. Selena stood in the kitchen, absent-mindedly stirring her coffee, but her thoughts were spinning in 100 directions. Yesterday had been a lot. Ethan had handled it better than she expected. He hadn't snapped at Lily, hadn't tried to force a connection. But Selena knew her daughter. Lily was watching, waiting, and she didn't trust easily. Selena sighed, taking a sip of coffee just as the doorbell rang. Frowning, she wiped her hands on a dish towel and went to open the door. Her breath caught. Ethan stood there looking ridiculously put together for 9 in the morning, holding a paper bag and 2 coffee cups. "What are you doing here?" she asked, narrowing her eyes. He lifted the bag slightly. "Peace offering." Selena crossed her arms, arching a brow. "That depends." "What's in the bag?" Ethan smirked. "Bagels. From that place on 5th you used to love." Her lips parted in surprise. "You remember that?" His expression softened just slightly. "I remember a lot of things." Selena swallowed, shifting on her feet. She had no idea how to handle this side of him. She hesitated for a second too long, and Ethan sighed. "I come in peace, Selena. No lawyers, no fights, just breakfast." She exhaled and stepped aside. The kitchen felt smaller with him in it. Selena leaned against the counter, watching as Ethan set the bag down, pulling out the bagels and handing her a coffee. "Where are the girls?" he asked. They left for school an hour ago. Ethan nodded, taking a sip of his own coffee before glancing around the kitchen. His gaze landed on the refrigerator. Selina tensed, because she knew what was there. Tacked onto the fridge were a dozen drawings, report cards, and photos. And right in the middle, a picture of Lily and Sophie at the beach last summer. Ethan's gaze lingered on it. Selina saw the way his jaw tightened, the way his fingers curled slightly. 6 years. 6 years of moments he had never been a part of. His voice was quiet when he spoke. They look happy. Selina's heart squeezed. They are. He nodded, but his expression was distant, as if he were grieving something silently. And for the first time she felt something other than anger toward him. Pity, regret. Because no matter how much she had tried to protect her girls, she had also stolen something from him. Ethan's voice pulled her back. Lily still doesn't trust me. Selina sighed, running a hand through her hair. She's not going to overnight. He exhaled slowly, rubbing the back of his neck. Yeah, I figured. Selina studied him. You handled it well, though. Ethan smirked. High praise. She rolled her eyes. I'm serious. You didn't push. You let her feel how she needed to feel. His smirk faded slightly. She reminds me of me. Selina tilted her head. She does, doesn't she? There was something almost fond in Ethan's expression as he looked at the picture again. She watches people, studies them, decides if they're worth trusting. Selina nodded. And if they break her trust once, it's 10 times harder to get it back. Ethan's gaze flicked to hers, something unreadable in his expression. Selina swallowed. They weren't just talking about Lily anymore. The tension stretched between them, thick and heavy, and for the first time in years the past felt dangerously close. Selina broke the moment first. I should get ready for work, she said, turning away. Ethan nodded, stepping back. Yeah, I should go. But before he reached the door, he hesitated. Then, so quietly she almost didn't hear it. Thanks for letting me in today. Selina closed her eyes briefly. When she opened them, he was already gone, and somehow she felt more unsettled than before. Selina hadn't expected Ethan to show up at ballet practice. And yet, there he was, standing near the entrance of the small studio, looking completely out of place among the group of parents in yoga pants and sneakers. He was in a tailored suit, crisp and commanding, and it was almost laughable how much he stuck out. But what stunned her more than his presence was Sophie's reaction. Her daughter lit up like a Christmas tree. Mom, he came! Selina's stomach twisted as Sophie broke into a sprint and launched herself at Ethan. For a brief second, he looked completely caught off guard. Then something in his expression softened, and he bent down, catching her effortlessly. Selina's heart did something strange and unwelcome. Ethan shifted Sophie onto his hip, looking down at her with genuine amusement. Did you think I wouldn't? He asked. Sophie grinned. I thought maybe you were busy. Ethan arched a brow. I told you, I don't break promises. Selina swallowed hard. Because he wasn't just saying that to Sophie, he was saying it to her, too. Selina sat on the wooden bench at the side of the studio, arms crossed as she watched the growing spectacle beside her. Ethan was watching ballet practice like it was a board meeting. He sat stiffly, his hands clasped in front of him, his eyes focused on Sophie as she twirled across the room. And despite his composed demeanor, he looked captivated. Selina sighed. You didn't have to come. Ethan turned slightly, arching a brow. You think I'm here out of obligation? Aren't you? She countered. His gaze flickered, and for a moment, something unreadable crossed his face. No, he said simply. Selina exhaled, looking back at Sophie. She's going to get attached, Ethan. Ethan's jaw tightened. I'm counting on it. Selina turned sharply. Don't say things like that if you're not staying. I am staying, she scoffed. You say that now. I mean it. His voice was steady, unwavering, and it threw her completely off balance. Because this wasn't the Ethan Caldwell she had known. That Ethan had been ambitious, always moving, always chasing something bigger. This Ethan? He was here. He was present. And it scared her. Because if he meant it, if he was really staying, then that meant she had to start lowering her walls. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that. Sophie was still buzzing with excitement, talking Ethan's ear off about everything she had learned. Selina stood by the car, waiting while Ethan crouched down beside Sophie. Can I come again next time? He asked. Sophie gasped dramatically. Really? Ethan smirked. If your mom says it's okay. Sophie turned to Selina with wide, hopeful eyes. Selina exhaled. If you want to, I won't stop you. Sophie cheered, throwing her arms around Ethan's neck. And Selina saw it. The way Ethan's face changed. The way he closed his eyes for a second, like he was absorbing the moment, like he was memorizing it. Because this was new for him. This was something he had never had before. Selina's heart clenched. Because she had spent so many years being angry at him, so many years believing he didn't deserve this. But maybe he did. Selina sat on the couch, staring at the half-empty glass of wine in her hands. Her mind was a mess. Because Ethan was staying. And not just in a show-up-when-it's-convenient way. He was staying in the way that mattered. He was showing up. He was being patient. He was proving her wrong. And that terrified her. Because if Ethan was no longer the man she had walked away from, then maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong about everything. Ethan stepped out of his office onto the glass-paneled balcony, staring out at the New York skyline. The city stretched before him, towering buildings, flashing billboards, the steady pulse of money, power, and ambition. It should have felt like home. But it didn't. Not anymore. Because home wasn't here. Home was a quiet house in Brooklyn. Home was two little girls with bright eyes and endless curiosity, and a woman who still wasn't sure if she could trust him. He exhaled sharply, running a hand over his face. Big decisions look better with whiskey, a voice called from behind him. Ethan turned. Nathan Pierce, his oldest friend and business partner, leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching him with knowing amusement. Ethan smirked. What makes you think I have a big decision to make? Nathan raised a brow. Because you're standing out here looking like you just found out your entire fortune disappeared overnight. Ethan exhaled. It's nothing. Nathan stepped forward. Is that nothing spelled S-E-L-E-N-A? Ethan didn't answer. Nathan chuckled. I knew it. Man, you've been different ever since you found out about them. Ethan stiffened. I should have known a long time ago. Nathan's teasing faded slightly. Yeah, you should have. But now you do. The real question is, what are you going to do about it? Ethan tensed. I am doing something about it. Nathan studied him for a moment before nodding toward the view. You built all this, Ethan, this empire. But now? You don't even look like you belong here. Ethan said nothing, because he had been thinking the same damn thing. Nathan's voice softened. What do you want? Ethan let out a slow breath. I don't know anymore. Nathan shook his head. Yeah, you do. You just don't want to say it out loud yet. Ethan's jaw tightened, because Nathan was right, and that scared the hell out of him. Ethan stood outside Selina's house, debating whether to knock. This wasn't planned. He hadn't told her he was coming, but something in him needed to see her. Before he could talk himself out of it, he rang the doorbell. The porch light flickered on, and a moment later, Selena appeared at the door, barefoot in leggings and an oversized sweater, her hair loose and slightly messy. For a moment she just stared at him. Then, with a sigh, she stepped back. "Come in." Ethan stepped inside, feeling the warmth of the house wrap around him. Selena crossed her arms. "This is unexpected." Ethan nodded. "Yeah, I needed to talk to you." Selena arched a brow. "About?" He hesitated. Then, before he lost his nerve, he said it. "I'm thinking about stepping back from the company." Selena blinked. "What?" Ethan exhaled. Not leaving entirely, but shifting focus. Her arms lowered slightly. "Why?" He met her gaze. "You know why." Selena's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Then, quietly, she said, "Ethan, that's your whole life." He let out a humorless chuckle. "I thought it was, but now, I don't know." Selena swallowed. "And you're telling me this because—" Ethan took a step closer, his voice quieter now. "Because you need to know I'm serious, about all of this, about them, about you." Selena's breath hitched. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, as if she wanted to reach for him but didn't trust herself to. "I don't want you to do something you'll regret," she murmured. Ethan shook his head. "The only thing I regret is missing the last 6 years." Selena's eyes softened. For the first time, Ethan saw real conflict there, like she wanted to believe him, like she was starting to. Then a small voice broke through the moment. "Mom?" They both turned. Lily stood at the edge of the stairs, rubbing her tired eyes. Selena immediately softened. "Hey, sweetheart. Couldn't sleep?" Lily shook her head. Then her gaze drifted to Ethan. She hesitated. Then, to his absolute shock, she asked, "Are you staying for dinner?" Ethan's breath caught. Selena's brows lifted slightly. And for the first time in 6 years, Ethan felt like he belonged. Ethan barely had time to process Lily's question. She stood at the base of the stairs, hair messy from sleep, oversized pajama shirt hanging off her small frame, looking at him with cautious expectation. "Are you staying for dinner?" Selena looked just as surprised as he felt. Lily hadn't warmed to him. She had been resistant, skeptical, guarded. And yet, here she was, offering something fragile, something uncertain. Ethan's throat tightened. If he answered wrong, the moment would break. He kept his voice careful, steady. "I'd love to." Lily blinked, like she hadn't actually expected him to say yes. Selena, still clearly thrown, hesitated before nodding toward the kitchen. "I was just about to heat up leftovers." Ethan smirked. "Fancy." Selena rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched just slightly. Lily, still watching him, turned and padded toward the kitchen without another word. It wasn't much, but it was something. Selena had reheated pasta and garlic bread, plating it carefully. Lily sat at the table pretending to read a book, but Ethan could tell she was watching him from the corner of her eye. Sophie, on the other hand, was already digging into her plate. Ethan sat across from Lily, trying not to make a big deal of it, trying not to look too eager. Selena slid into the seat beside Sophie, clearing her throat. "All right, let's eat." They fell into a quiet, cautious rhythm. The only sounds were the clinking of forks, the occasional hum of conversation. Sophie was the first to break the silence. "So, do you really build buildings?" Ethan swallowed his bite and nodded. "Yeah, some of the biggest ones in the city." Sophie's eyes lit up. "Like which ones?" Ethan hesitated. "Have you ever seen the Caldwell Tower?" Sophie gasped. "You built that?" Ethan smirked. "I helped." Selena gave him a knowing look over her glass of water. Helped is an understatement. Lily suddenly spoke, her voice quiet but pointed. "Do you always talk about your job?" Ethan turned to her, surprised by the sudden challenge. "Not always." Lily twirled her pasta around her fork. Seems like you do. Selena exhaled slowly. Lily? But Ethan shook his head. It's okay. He met Lily's gaze head-on. I used to talk about my job all the time. It was the most important thing in my life. Lily's fingers tightened around her fork. But it's not anymore, he added. Lily's jaw tensed. Because of us? Ethan didn't hesitate. Yes. Selena froze, her fork hovering mid-air. Sophie looked between them, curious but quiet. Lily, however, wasn't buying it. People don't change that fast. Ethan exhaled. I didn't say I changed fast, but I am changing. Lily stared at him for a long moment. Then she set her fork down. I'm done. Selena closed her eyes briefly. Lily, I'm tired, she muttered, sliding off her chair and heading upstairs. The air in the kitchen was thick. Selena sighed, rubbing her temples. Sophie hesitated before looking at Ethan. She does that when she's nervous. Ethan nodded. Good to know. Selena met his gaze, still holding a trace of exhaustion. Don't take it personally. I won't. Because Lily wasn't pushing him away because she hated him. She was pushing him away because she was scared to let him in. And Ethan was going to prove that he wasn't leaving, no matter how long it took. Selena stood at the sink, rinsing off dishes, lost in thought. Ethan had stayed for dinner, and for the first time in 6 years he had been part of their routine. It was strange. Not bad, but strange. She hadn't expected Lily to invite him, hadn't expected Ethan to handle it with so much patience, hadn't expected him to say things like, "It's not the most important thing anymore." Because Ethan Caldwell never put anything above his career. And yet, the way he had looked at their daughters tonight, the way he had softened when Sophie smiled at him, the way he had taken Lily's challenge without irritation, that wasn't the Ethan she remembered. It was someone else. Someone better. Penny for your thoughts? She turned, startled, to find Ethan leaning against the doorway. She wiped her hands on a towel, giving him a tired look. You're still here? He smirked. You say that like you expected me to run. Selena exhaled. Old habits. His smirk faded slightly. I get it. For a long moment they just looked at each other, and it was suddenly too much history, too many unresolved emotions. Selena cleared her throat. Lily just needs time. Ethan nodded. I'll give her as much as she needs. Selena hesitated. You really mean that, don't you? Ethan held her gaze. Yes. Selena swallowed. Because that was the moment she realized something terrifying. She was starting to believe him. And that was dangerous. Because if Ethan really had changed, then maybe, just maybe, she had been wrong to leave. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, arms crossed, watching as Selena moved around the kitchen, pulling out plates, setting them down with just a little too much force, avoiding his gaze. She was agitated. She had been ever since Mark left. And Ethan wasn't stupid. He knew why, because he had gotten to her, not just with Mark, but with the way he had challenged her, the way he had pushed into the space she had kept between them for years. Selena exhaled through her nose, finally turning toward him. You don't get to do that. Ethan tilted his head. Do what? She narrowed her eyes. Mark has been in my life for years. He's been there for the girls. You don't get to waltz back in and act like... I'm not acting like anything, Ethan interrupted, voice cool. I just don't like the way he looks at you. Selena scoffed. That's not your problem. Ethan leaned forward. Maybe not, but it bothers me anyway. Selena blinked, caught off guard by his honesty. Then she shook her head, exasperated. God, you're impossible. Ethan smirked. You used to like that about me. Selena exhaled sharply, gripping the counter. You don't get to pull that card, Ethan. He stood slowly. and suddenly the space between them felt dangerous, charged. Selena didn't move, but he could see it, the way her breath hitched, the way her fingers curled against the edge of the counter. She was fighting this, fighting him. But he wasn't sure if she was winning. Ethan took a slow step forward. Selena swallowed. "What are you doing?" He tilted his head. Nothing. But they both knew it was a lie. Because this tension, this pull, it had always been there. Even when they fought, even when she left. And now? Now it was thicker than ever. Ethan's voice dropped slightly. "Tell me something." Selena blinked. "What? Do you really want him?" Selena's breath caught. Ethan's gaze searched hers, watching, waiting. And then, there it was. That flicker of hesitation. The way her lips parted like she wanted to answer but couldn't. Ethan took another step closer. "Because I don't think you do." Selena snapped out of it. She straightened, lifting her chin. "It doesn't matter what you think." Ethan smirked. "Doesn't it?" Selena exhaled sharply, shaking her head, and just like that, the spell was broken. She turned away. The girls will be home soon. Ethan clenched his jaw, exhaling slowly. He had pushed, but he hadn't crossed the line. Not yet. And maybe, just maybe, he was waiting for her to do it first. Lily was still distant. She had come home from school, taken one look at him, and immediately retreated to her room. Ethan didn't push. But Sophie? Sophie was still as open as ever. She sat beside him on the couch, chattering about her ballet class, her favorite books, the funniest thing her teacher had said that day. Ethan listened, and for the first time in his life, he felt like he wasn't missing anything. Selena watched from the kitchen, arms crossed, expression unreadable. But Ethan knew what she was thinking. He was becoming a part of this, and that terrified her. Because if he became part of it, if she let him in completely, then he could break her all over again, and neither of them knew if she would survive it. Ethan sat on the park bench, watching as Lily and Sophie ran ahead, their laughter floating through the crisp autumn air. 6 months ago, he wouldn't have believed this moment was. 6 months ago, he hadn't even known them. Now they were his world. Selena sat beside him, arms crossed, a quiet smile playing at her lips. "They're getting faster," she murmured, watching the girls race toward the swings. Ethan smirked. "Sophie's going to be a track star if ballet doesn't work out." Selena chuckled. "And Lily?" Ethan tilted his head, studying the girl who had once refused to even look at him. Lily wasn't running ahead with the same carefree excitement as her sister. But she wasn't staying back either. Instead, she turned her head slightly, just enough to make sure Ethan was still there. That was progress. That was everything. "She's going to run the world," Ethan murmured. Selena smiled, a touch of pride in her expression. "Yeah, she will." For a moment they just sat there, watching the girls, sharing a silence that didn't feel heavy anymore. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning to face her. "I'm selling my penthouse." Selena blinked, caught off guard. "What?" Ethan smirked. "Didn't think I'd ever let go of it, did you?" She hesitated. "It's a pretty big deal." Ethan nodded. "It was. But I don't need it anymore." Selena studied him, her expression shifting. "Where are you going?" Ethan shrugged. "I was thinking of something closer. Maybe Brooklyn." Selena's breath hitched. Ethan kept his voice calm but certain. "I'm not rushing this. I know you still need time." She swallowed. Ethan leaned in slightly. "But I also know this. What we have, what we could have again, it's worth waiting for." Selena let out a slow breath. For the first time since he had come back into her life, she didn't argue. She just looked at him, really looked at him, and let something in her walls crack. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. And that was more than enough. Ethan sat back, watching as Sophie ran up to them, breathless and excited. "Come push us on the swings," she demanded. Ethan smirked, standing up. "Bossy." Sophie grinned. "Mom says I get that from her." Ethan glanced at Selena, eyes twinkling. "I don't doubt it." He followed Sophie toward the swings, pausing only when he felt a small tug at his sleeve. He turned. Lily stood there, shifting on her feet. Ethan kept still, waiting. Then, without a word, she reached out and took his hand. Ethan's throat tightened. He squeezed her fingers gently, not pushing, not rushing, just holding on. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Caldwell finally understood what real wealth felt like. It had nothing to do with money, and everything to do with this, with them, with home.